She was born beneath the great baobab tree that marked the center of her village, a child whispered to be chosen by the spirits even before her first cry. Her mother said the earth trembled softly the night she was born, as though the roots themselves shifted to welcome her arrival. From her earliest days, there was a quiet strength about her, something that made elders watch her with wonder and others whisper in awe. She did not wear jewels or fine clothes like the daughters of chiefs, but the ground seemed to respond to her presence. Flowers opened when she touched them, vines curled gently around her wrists, and birds sang more brightly when she walked by. She was of the earth, shaped by it, and destined for something greater than ordinary life. On her 16th season, when the village gathered for the harvest festival, the spirits revealed her gift. As drums thundered and dancers stamped their feet upon the soil, she stood in the circle of firelight. The earth stirred beneath her, cracks opening in the dirt not with destruction but with birth. From those cracks rose roots, tender and strong, twining upwards, weaving themselves around her head. Vines spiraled into braids, blossoms unfolded into colors no dye could match, and leaves shimmered with dew that did not fade in the heat of the flames. By the time the vision ended, she stood crowned with living roots and flowers, her head radiant with the power of the land. The crowd gasped, some dropping to their knees, for they knew this was no ordinary crown. It was the gift of the ancestors, a sign that the spirits of the soil, the forests, and the hidden rivers had chosen her as their vessel. The crown was unlike anything crafted by human hands. It did not sit heavily on her head like gold or iron, but grew as though it belonged to her, pulsing faintly with the rhythm of her heartbeat. The blossoms shifted with the seasons, sometimes white and pure as morning, sometimes deep red as if dipped in sunset. The roots anchored into her very hair, alive and breathing, whispering secrets only she could hear. At night, when she lay down to sleep, she could feel the murmurs of the ancestors carried through the soil, their wisdom flowing into her dreams. In the day, the children followed her as if she were already a queen, and the elders looked upon her with reverence mixed with unease, for such a blessing was heavy and often came with a price. She carried the crown with grace, never boasting, never flaunting her gift. She did not demand obedience nor seek wealth, but instead walked among her people as she always had. When the fields withered from lack of rain, she placed her hands into the earth, and the roots from her crown extended into the ground, calling forth hidden waters to nourish the crops. When a child was sick, she sat beside their mat, and blossoms from her crown released a fragrance that calmed fevers and eased pain. Her people loved her for her kindness, but some feared the power she held. Power, even when gentle, draws envy like flies to honey. While mothers blessed her name and children followed her steps, others in the shadows whispered that no woman should wear such a crown. They muttered that gifts from the spirits were dangerous, that roots could strangle as easily as they could nurture. But she remained steadfast. She believed her crown was not hers alone, but a bridge between her people and the land they lived upon. She would often walk barefoot into the forest, where even the oldest trees bent their branches low, recognizing her presence. She would sing songs her grandmother taught her, and the vines of her crown would sway as though carried by a wind no one else could feel. Birds settled upon her shoulders without fear, and even snakes coiled harmlessly at her feet. To the spirits of the earth she was kin, not a stranger. Still, the crown set her apart. She could never be just a girl of the village again. She was a living symbol, a reminder that the ancestors still watched, still chose, still intervened in the world of the living. And symbols often attract both devotion and danger. Though her crown was born of roots and blossoms, soft and fragrant, there was strength coiled within it, the kind of strength that could split stone or crush bone if provoked. The ancestors had not given it merely as decoration. It was a shield, a weapon, a promise. And though she did not yet know it, the day would come when that promise would be tested, when her crown would no longer only heal and bless, but rise in wrath to defend its bearer. The whispers started quietly, carried from one household to another like smoke that refuses to fade. At first, they spoke in awe of her, the young woman whose head carried a living crown that grew from the earth itself. The roots twisted delicately, weaving themselves into a circlet of vines and blossoms that never withered, glowing faintly with life even in the dimness of night. Her ancestors had given her this gift, a sacred bond between her spirit and the soil beneath their feet. But where reverence blooms, envy often takes root, and soon admiration soured into restless murmurs. Some among the villagers began to question why the crown had chosen her and not another. There were men who believed their strength made them more deserving, women who thought their lineage held greater claim, and elders who muttered that the spirits had erred. Her presence reminded them of their own smallness, and in that reflection they saw only bitterness. Respect became resentment, and the very thing that had once made them proud now gnawed at their hearts. They watched her as she walked through the village paths, her crown alive and radiant, its roots stretching softly with each step as though in harmony with the earth itself. Children would follow her at first, laughing and pointing, enchanted by the flowers that shifted colors with the passing of the sun. But slowly their parents pulled them away, whispering warnings that she was dangerous, that too much closeness to her meant submitting to powers beyond human control. What was once joy became suspicion, and even the children learned to cast her shadowed glances. There were those who craved the respect she commanded. Whenever she entered a gathering, conversations would pause, and all eyes turned to her. Not out of malice, but because the presence of the crown demanded reverence, as though the spirits themselves stood beside her. Some began to covet this attention, yearning for such authority, such quiet dominance over a crowd. In their envy, they told themselves that if they could possess the crown, they too would inherit the power and dignity that radiated from her. It was easier to believe that the crown was the source of her strength rather than admit it was her own soul, intertwined with the spirits of the land. Soon rumors began to fester like mold in dark corners. They whispered that her crown was not a blessing but a curse, that the roots carried venom, that the blossoms fed on blood, and that her beauty was not her own but stolen from the soil of their ancestors' graves. At night, villagers gathered in hushed circles, voices tense with the unease of their jealousy. Some spoke of how the spirits had always chosen one to carry their gifts, but others claimed this time the choice was wrong, that perhaps darker forces had intervened. In this growing storm of envy, her kindness was twisted into arrogance. When she offered fruits from her harvest, they muttered that the earth only gave to her because it feared her. When she helped mend roofs or weave baskets, they claimed she did it only to display superiority. Every gesture of humility was stained by their suspicion, and soon even her silence became a crime. The young woman felt the weight of this change pressing against her chest. She could sense the shift in the air when she walked among them, the way conversations fell short, the way eyes lingered too long, filled not with admiration but with hunger or fear. She carried the spirit's gift with dignity, but inside she wondered if her ancestors had erred in placing this burden upon her. She had asked for no crown, no power, and no reverence. All she wanted was to live among her people, to belong to them as she once had. But belonging was slipping away, stolen by envy's creeping hands. Where once she had heard songs of celebration, she now caught fragments of mockery. Where once doors opened to welcome her, now they closed too quickly, leaving her standing alone in the dust. Each night, as she lay with the roots of her crown gently humming against her scalp, she prayed to the spirits for guidance. Yet even as the spirits whispered comfort into her heart, she knew the villagers' envy was not a storm that would pass. It was an axe, being sharpened in the shadows, preparing to strike at her very soul. And though she did not yet know it, those whispers would soon grow into hands that reached for her crown, not realizing that envy of the earth's gift could never end without consequence. The whispers of jealousy did not remain harmless for long. Among the villagers, a small group of rivals began to gather in the shadows, their voices hushed but burning with venom. They were men and women who had long felt overlooked, whose pride was wounded by the way the young woman's presence drew respect from elders and admiration from children. They watched as others sought her guidance, as disputes quieted when she spoke, as the land itself seemed to respond to her steps. Their hearts, already hardened by envy, turned darker with each passing day until the idea of destroying her no longer seemed unthinkable. It became their only goal. They reasoned that her crown was the source of her strength, a symbol that bound her to the spirits. If it were gone, then she would be nothing but an ordinary girl, stripped of power and honor. Without the crown, they told themselves, the people would see her for what she truly was, a pretender who had been elevated too high. The plan grew slowly, nurtured by bitterness and secret gatherings in the night. Around fires that flickered with deceit, they whispered of flames that could consume even sacred gifts. They convinced one another that fire was the purest way to break her hold on the village, for fire left nothing but ash and smoke. Roots may cling to the earth, one said, but fire devours even the strongest roots. Another, with a cruel smile, added, and blossoms wither faster than anything else in the heat of flames. She will be left bare, humiliated. They laughed quietly at the thought, the sound sharp and empty in the stillness of the night. Their hatred was now a pact, sealed with their shared desire to see her undone. They watched her more closely than ever before, waiting for the moment when her guard would falter. Every time she bent to touch the soil or raised her face to the sky in quiet communion with the spirits, they mocked her under their breath. To them her devotion was arrogance, her gift an insult to their own worth. They crafted lies to strengthen their resolve, telling each other that the crown had been given not by the ancestors, but by trickery, that perhaps she had stolen it, or bewitched the spirits into favoring her. With every lie, their hatred deepened until it burned hotter than the fires they planned to set. When the moon was hidden behind heavy clouds, they met at the edge of the village where the air smelled of damp earth and smoke from the dying fires of the day. There they spoke of how and when they would strike. One suggested waiting until she slept, stealing into her home with torches and setting the crown ablaze where it rested by her bed. Another, more daring, proposed attacking her during one of her walks in the forest, when she would be alone and away from the protection of others. After much debate, they agreed the humiliation would be greater if the fire consumed her crown in front of the whole village. They wanted not only to strip her of power but also to shatter the reverence people held for her. The fire would not just burn the crown, it would burn her honor, her dignity, and the trust of the people. They prepared carefully, gathering dry wood, resin, and oil, things that would ignite quickly and burn fiercely. Each act of preparation carried with it a strange mixture of excitement and dread. Deep inside, they knew the crown was no ordinary ornament. It pulsed faintly with life, its blossoms still opening even when plucked, its vines curling as if aware of the hands that touched it. Yet their greed for power silenced the warnings of their hearts. "It is only roots and flowers," one scoffed, though his voice wavered slightly. "Fire will end it." Another muttered, "And if the spirits grow angry, we will blame her for bringing danger upon us. The people will turn against her." Their words gave them courage, though in truth, it was not courage but desperation driving them forward. The night before they were to act, each of them dreamed strange and unsettling visions. One dreamed of roots breaking through the floor of his hut, tangling around his legs until he could no longer move. Another saw fire, but instead of consuming the crown, it spread across the village, devouring everything in sight. A third dreamed of being buried alive beneath blossoming vines that whispered her name. They woke in cold sweats, shaken, but none spoke of their dreams to the others. Pride and fear of appearing weak kept their silence. They clung to the plan as though it were their salvation, convincing themselves the visions were nothing but tricks of the mind. By day they carried on as though nothing was amiss, smiling and nodding in public while their hearts pounded with anticipation of what was to come. Some even went to her with false kindness, asking her advice on trivial matters, watching her face closely as though they might catch a glimpse of weakness. But she remained serene, her crown alive and glowing faintly with an inner strength they could neither understand nor endure. The closer the day drew, the more frantic their envy became. Their whispers turned to sharp commands, their plotting to restless urgency. They were ready to act, and in their blindness, they believed that fire would make them victorious. What they did not know was that the crown was not merely a gift to her but a living bond between the earth and the spirits. To touch it with malice was to touch the roots of the world itself, and the earth remembers every hand that dares to harm it. Yet the rivals were deaf to such truths, for jealousy had deafened them long ago. In their minds, they already saw her stripped of her crown, her influence gone, her voice silenced before the village. Their hearts beat like drums as the day of fire drew near, not knowing that they were weaving their own undoing with every step they took toward betrayal. The night was heavy with silence, the kind that presses on the skin like a warning. No wind stirred the trees, no owls hooted from the branches, and even the crickets seemed to withhold their songs, as if the earth itself anticipated something dark approaching. She lay in her hut, drifting into slumber, unaware that her name had been twisted into the language of betrayal just beyond her door. A group of villagers, faces hardened by envy, crept through the shadows. They carried no drums, no torches, no chants of honor, only hushed whispers and a fire hidden in clay pots. The bitterness in their hearts had grown wild, and tonight, it demanded action. "Without her crown she is nothing," one hissed. "The spirits will abandon her. Then she will be just like us." Her crown of roots and blossoms, glowing faintly even in the night, had become the symbol of everything they thought they could never be. To them, it was a reminder that the spirits had chosen her, not them. And in their envy, they convinced themselves that stripping her of it would restore balance, that by destroying it, they could take away her voice, her power, her destiny. The young woman stirred, her spirit uneasy. Dreams had warned her of storms, of snakes weaving through her hair, of fire licking at her roots. She sat upright, heart pounding, but before she could rise, the door to her hut was flung open. A hand clamped over her mouth. Another grabbed her arms. She fought, her body thrashing like a trapped bird, but there were too many of them. "Hold her," one of the plotters commanded. Rough hands pinned her to the ground. Her cries were muffled, her strength overwhelmed by their numbers. Shadows danced on the walls of the hut as the hidden fire was brought forward, its orange glow flickering across the faces of those she had once called kin. Her crown shimmered faintly, the roots alive, the blossoms trembling as if they too sensed the coming violence. "Take it," hissed one of the women, eyes sharp with jealousy. "Burn it before the spirits can protect her." The flame was lowered toward her head. The roots quivered as if alive, trying to withdraw from the fire. She felt heat searing close, the scent of singed leaves filling the hut. A scream tore from her throat as the first lick of flame caught the vine, the blossoms curling into ash. Her crown, her sacred bond to the ancestors, was being consumed before her eyes. But the villagers did not stop. They pressed her down harder, ignoring her tears, ignoring her pleas. "Now she will know she is mortal," one muttered. "Now she will learn that she is not above us." The fire spread quickly, roots crackling, blossoms disintegrating into smoke. The hut filled with the bitter scent of burning earth. She closed her eyes, feeling her spirit tremble. For a moment, despair nearly swallowed her. The crown was not just adornment, it was her ancestors' blessing, the whisper of spirits in her ear, the living proof that she was chosen. And now it was being torn from her, reduced to cinders by those who once shared meals, laughter, and stories with her. Yet in the midst of her agony she felt something stir deep inside. Beneath the pain, beneath the weight of betrayal, there was a pulse. A heartbeat not her own, ancient and vast, echoing through her chest. The earth itself seemed to thrum with it, as though the soil beneath her hut had awakened. The fire devoured the last of the crown, but the warmth did not fade. Instead, it sank into her scalp, into her blood, into her bones. The villagers, too busy celebrating their cruel victory, did not see the way her eyes glowed faintly in the darkness. They released her, leaving her on the ground as smoke rose from the smoldering crown. "It is done," one of them said. "She is nothing now. Let her live and let her know shame. Tomorrow she will bow to us like the rest." They slipped back into the night, leaving her broken on the floor, her hair singed, her crown reduced to ashes. Alone she wept, not only for herself but for the betrayal that cut deeper than fire ever could. She had given her strength to protect these people, her prayers to keep the village safe, and in return, they had chosen envy over gratitude. But even as her tears dampened the earth beneath her, something strange happened. The soil drank her sorrow, and from it, a faint green sprout pushed upward through the dirt floor. Then another. Tiny roots began to weave around her head once more, faint but alive, as though the earth itself refused to let her be stripped of her gift. She touched the fragile tendrils, realization dawning. The crown was never merely upon her, it was within her. The betrayal had not severed her bond to the spirits. It had awakened it. As dawn crept over the horizon, she rose from her hut, her head bare but her spirit burning brighter than ever. The villagers thought they had destroyed her, but they had only given birth to something far greater. And though she walked silently that morning, her silence was not weakness. It was the calm before a storm. The silence that followed the crown's burning was not the silence of peace. It was the silence of something waiting, a pause between heartbeats, a stillness before a storm. The villagers walked away from her collapsed form, convinced that the fire had severed her from the spirits forever. They whispered among themselves with smug satisfaction, each voice tinged with the bitterness that had driven them to betrayal. "She was nothing without that crown," some said. "Now the land will forget her," others sneered. But the land did not forget. The land listened. Beneath the soil, far from the eyes of those who celebrated her downfall, something ancient stirred. The roots that had once woven themselves into her crown, the thorns that had grown into her throne, were not dead. Fire had scorched the surface, blackened and brittle, but deep below the surface, where the flames had not reached, life pulsed. Roots intertwined, whispering to one another in the language of the earth, a tongue older than any human speech. The soil itself held her memory, each grain cradling her tears, her pain, her strength. And it remembered. At first, it was faint, small vibrations like a breath through hidden tunnels underground. But the murmur spread, passing from root to root, from seed to seed, like secrets carried on the wind. "She is not gone," they whispered. "She is with us still." Beneath the charred remains of her throne, roots glowed faintly in the darkness, veins of light threading through the earth like molten rivers. They pulsed with rhythm, steady and sure, as though mimicking a heartbeat. And in time they became one with her own faltering breath. Though her body lay weakened on the ground, her essence had not scattered, it had seeped into the soil, joining with the roots, sinking deeper than fire could ever reach. The soil cradled her as a mother cradles a wounded child. It rocked her gently, humming with the voices of ancestors buried long before her birth. "Rise," they whispered. "Your roots are ours. Your strength is ours. What they sought to burn cannot be undone, for we live beneath every flame." Her fingers twitched against the earth, blackened nails pressing into the dirt. She did not yet rise, but something within her shifted. She could feel the whispers moving through her veins, echoing in her chest. She was not alone. Every tree, every blade of grass, every creeping vine shared their breath with her, filling her hollow lungs with green life. Above, the villagers returned to their huts. The air was heavy, thick with smoke and a silence they could not name. Children awoke in the night, crying at dreams of roots coiling through their floors. Animals hid in corners, refusing to graze. Even the wind seemed uneasy, swirling in confused patterns, refusing to leave the village in peace. But still the people believed their work was done. Still they thought her power had been burned to nothing. Far below them, in the darkness of the soil, a council of roots gathered. Some were ancient, gnarled and thick, belonging to trees that had stood since before the village was born. Others were tender and new, sprouting from seeds no larger than a fingertip. But together they hummed with the same voice, carrying the same truth. The crown had never been her power. The crown had only been a symbol, a vessel through which her bond with the earth became visible. What was woven above the ground was only a shadow of what thrived below it. The soil whispered this truth into her bones. Her back arched slightly where she lay on the charred ground, smoke curling from her hair, and though her eyes did not yet open, a tremor rippled through her body. She felt the hum of roots coiling around her spirit like protective arms. She felt the heartbeat of the land thudding beneath her chest. She felt her own sorrow sinking deep into the soil, where it was swallowed and returned as strength. The betrayal still cut deep. She could still feel the weight of their hands holding her down, the burn of flames devouring her crown. She remembered the faces of those who had once sung her praises but now sneered as they pressed her to the earth. Anger coiled inside her, sharp and bitter, but the soil did not let it rot. It transformed her rage, twisting it into resolve, binding it with patience. "Do not rise too soon," the roots murmured. "Let them believe. Let them rest. The earth works in silence before it breaks the surface." The night stretched on, heavy and strange. The stars shone cold above, but deep beneath the surface, warmth gathered, life swelling in hidden tunnels. Worms writhed. Beetles crawled. Seeds split open with tiny cries of green. It was as though the land itself had decided to bloom in secret rebellion. And through it all, her spirit spread, root to root, seed to seed, weaving herself into the unseen network that held the world together. By dawn, the villagers noticed a change. The ash where her crown had burned was no longer gray but flecked with green, tiny shoots pushing through the blackened soil. Some scoffed, claiming it was nothing but weeds. Others shifted uneasily, remembering that weeds too belong to the earth, and weeds grow fastest where they are not wanted. But no one dared touch them. Beneath their feet, the whispers continued, rising in strength. The soil no longer hummed softly but thrummed with energy, a living drumbeat that matched the slow, steady rhythm of her returning breath. And though she did not yet rise, the earth prepared her. The whispers became promises. The promises became roots. And the roots became the quiet foundation of something far greater than the crown that had burned. Because what lived beneath the soil was not only memory, it was power, patient and unyielding, waiting to burst through the ground when the time was right. The earth shivered that night, though no one above noticed at first. To the villagers, the night was calm, quiet, too quiet, yet beneath the soil, something ancient stirred. The roots, once delicate strands of life woven into her crown, now thickened with fury and remembrance. They pulsed with a rhythm that mimicked a heartbeat, as if the land itself had taken her suffering into its veins. What the villagers had set ablaze was not just a crown but a bond, a living connection between the woman and the soil. Fire had devoured the surface, but it had not reached deep enough. The embers of betrayal, the pain of her silenced cry, sank into the underground where roots remembered and roots refused to die. The first stirrings were subtle, tiny tendrils pressing through the ash-laden soil, curling like fingers testing the air. Then, stronger and faster, the roots began to crack through the ground in long twisting spirals, blackened from the fire yet glowing faintly with an inner light. They moved not blindly but with purpose, carrying within them the memory of her suffering. In the huts nearby, children stirred uneasily in their sleep, dreaming of tangled forests and voices that called their names. Dogs whimpered and refused to leave their corners, their ears pinned back as they sensed the shift in the earth. The elders felt it too, though they could not name it, a pressure beneath their feet, a hum in the soil. The roots spread wide, not only where she had fallen, but across the village paths, curling under doors, wrapping lightly around the wooden beams of homes. They did not yet strike, but they watched. They listened. In the darkness, those who had tied her down and set the flame upon her crown tossed and turned in restless sleep. Their dreams burned with images of fire that would not go out, and in every dream the fire did not consume her, it consumed them. They woke sweating, their hearts pounding, unaware that outside their walls, roots curled higher against their huts, tightening with each passing moment. The soil itself seemed alive, breathing in slow rhythms. Ashes that had scattered in the night sank into the ground, feeding the roots like offerings. Each memory of betrayal, each whispered mockery she had endured, each hand that held her down, all of it was absorbed and stored. The roots carried not only her essence but the truth of what had been done to her. At dawn, the villagers awoke to find cracks along the ground where none had been the day before. Thin green shoots had pushed through, impossibly fast, their tips glowing faintly as though touched by fire yet refusing to burn. Children gathered around them, reaching out to touch, only to draw back as the shoots recoiled, alive, almost aware. The elders muttered among themselves. "It is only the earth," one said. "The rains must be coming." Yet deep down they feared otherwise, for they had felt the weight of silence in the air since her collapse. A silence too heavy, as if nature itself had paused in judgment. As the day wore on, the roots grew bolder. They crept along the edges of the fields, entwining with the stalks of grain until the crops themselves seemed to bow. They wrapped around the old trees, drawing from them strength and memory. Every living thing they touched seemed to bend toward a single purpose: remembrance and retribution. By nightfall, the ground trembled again, more pronounced this time. Villagers clutched one another as they heard low groans echoing from beneath the soil. Children cried, and the drums that usually called the village together for evening songs fell silent. No one dared to beat them. Then came the sound, the tearing of earth as roots thick as arms split the ground wide. They rose like serpents, coiling in the air before slamming down with the force of thunder. Dust filled the air and the people screamed, rushing from their huts. The roots moved with purpose, each one searching, reaching, remembering. They found the hut of the man who had held the torch. His walls splintered as roots smashed through, wrapping around his wrists and ankles, pinning him as he shrieked. Another root coiled around the woman who had tied the knots that bound the crown to her head, lifting her from the ground as though she weighed nothing. The villagers scattered in terror, yet the roots did not chase them all. They sought only those whose hands had played a role in her betrayal. Yet even those who had stood aside, who had said nothing, felt the ground shift beneath their feet and the air grow heavy with judgment. The roots twisted higher, stretching toward the moonlight. On their surfaces, faint patterns began to appear, lines that looked like veins of fire, glowing red as though carrying within them the flame that had once sought to destroy her. It was not fire as before, not consuming but transforming, marking the roots with living embers that pulsed like breath. The villagers gathered in the square, trembling, staring at the spectacle. Some whispered that she had returned, others that the earth itself had risen against them. None dared to speak her name aloud. And then, in the center of it all, a form began to rise. Not of flesh but of root and ash and ember. The outline of her figure took shape, her face half hidden, half formed, yet unmistakable. It was not resurrection in the way they had imagined, it was remembrance given shape, vengeance woven into roots. She stood, silent but unyielding, her presence undeniable. The awakening had begun, and the village understood in that instant that what they had tried to burn could never truly die. What is rooted in the earth remembers. What is bound to the soil cannot be erased. And now, the roots had risen not only to remember but to reclaim. The ground pulsed again, and with every tremor, the villagers knew, this was only the beginning. The silence that had hung over the village broke with a low rumble. The ground quivered, and every heart stuttered in fear. What they thought had been finished, what they believed they had destroyed, was stirring once more. From the ashes, from the soil, from the very bones of the earth beneath their feet, something alive began to move. At first it was only a whisper, faint cracks splitting the dry ground. But then the soil heaved, breaking open in jagged lines as roots, blackened with ash yet glowing faintly with an inner fire, clawed their way upward. These were not roots as the villagers had known before, no longer gentle tendrils that once held her crown in reverence. Now they were twisted, hardened by fire and sharpened by betrayal. They carried within them the memory of her suffering and the fury of the earth itself. The villagers watched, frozen in terror. Some tried to flee, but the soil beneath their feet betrayed them. The ground softened like mud, swallowing their steps, dragging them down as the roots slithered toward them. A scream split the night, sharp and desperate, as one of the men who had thrown the torch was ensnared. A root as thick as a wrist coiled around his ankle, dragging him down. He clawed at the ground, kicking, cursing, but the roots only tightened, wrapping around his body like snakes. Within moments, he was pinned to the earth, his cries muffled by the choking grip around his throat. The others broke into chaos. Some ran toward the forest, but the trees themselves seemed to close in, their roots rising to trip them, their branches bending to block their way. Others tried to fight back, hacking at the writhing tendrils with blades. But the roots only multiplied. For every one cut, two more rose in its place, twisting with rage, alive with vengeance. Then through the smoke in the soil something began to rise. At the very center of the devastation, from the ashes of what had been her body, the crown of thorns reappeared. But it was no longer a simple crown. The roots had grown thick and strong, intertwined with fire and ash. It pulsed like a living heart, glowing faintly as though the spirit that once wore it had never truly left. It hovered above the earth for a moment, and then, as if pulled by unseen hands, it lashed outward. The crown struck one of the women who had mocked her in life, the one who had spat words of cruelty as she was cast into suffering. The roots sprang from the crown, wrapping around the woman's arms, pulling her down onto her knees. She screamed as the thorns pricked her skin, each thorn burning as though dipped in fire. The crown dragged itself across the village, finding one by one those who had laughed, those who had thrown stones, those who had called her unworthy. The ground shook harder. Huts collapsed as roots burst from beneath them, tearing through walls and roofs. Fire that had once been their weapon now spread uncontrolled, ignited again by the fury of the earth. Villagers cried out for mercy, but the soil itself seemed deaf to their pleas. The punishment was not swift, it was deliberate. Each betrayer was bound, their limbs pulled, their throats squeezed. The earth made them feel the weight of every wound they had inflicted upon her. And all the while a strange, haunting sound filled the air. It was not quite a voice, but more like the deep groan of the earth, mixed with the whisper of roots sliding through soil. Yet to those bound in terror it carried meaning. It was her presence, she had not been silenced. Through the crown, through the roots she lived. One elder fell to his knees, weeping. "We thought we could end her," he whispered. "But she is the land cannot be burned." The crown lifted higher, glowing brighter as if in response. The ash that had once marked defeat was now the soil of rebirth. The villagers who had remained innocent, who had stood aside from the cruelty, huddled together in fear but found the roots did not touch them. Instead, the vines circled around them protectively, keeping them apart from those being punished. They watched in awe and terror as their neighbors, their leaders, their kin were dragged down into the earth itself. The betrayers clawed at the soil as they were pulled under, their screams fading as the ground swallowed them whole. Only silence remained when the last one vanished, their bodies entombed beneath the land they had defiled. When it was done, the roots stood tall, forming a great circle around the heart of the village. The crown hovered above them, suspended in the smoky air, alive with its new wrathful power. It was no longer just a crown, it was a warning, a living reminder of what they had tried to destroy. The villagers who survived could only stare in awe. They had witnessed the vengeance of the earth, and they knew nothing would ever be the same again. From that day forward, no one dared to mock her memory. The story spread far beyond the village, that the earth itself had risen to avenge her, that a crown of roots had dragged the guilty into the soil. And though the survivors rebuilt, they did so under the shadow of her power, careful with every step, every word, every action. For they knew, her vengeance was not finished. The roots were alive. The crown still glowed. And the earth never forgets. The earth trembled as if it were breathing, as if something vast and long forgotten stirred within its depths. Smoke curled from the scorched soil, mingling with the sharp scent of burned wood and the coppery tang of fear that lingered in the air. Villagers stood frozen, their faces pale and slick with sweat, their hands trembling with the memory of what they had done. They had laughed when her crown was set aflame, jeered when the girl collapsed, mocked her as she vanished into ashes. But now, the ground that had swallowed her seemed unwilling to remain silent. A low hum began to pulse through the earth, rhythmic and primal, echoing the heartbeat of something ancient. Then, from the smoke, a shape began to form, faint at first, like a mirage at the edge of sight. The villagers gasped, clutching at one another as the figure grew clearer, taller, steadier. She was rising, not from the sky, not from some distant horizon, but from the very soil they had cursed her into. Her skin bore the dark sheen of rich earth, glowing faintly with an inner light, as though she carried fire beneath her veins. Every movement shed particles of soil that glittered like stars, clinging to her form before drifting back to the ground. And upon her head, her crown, was no longer a fragile weave of thorns and branches. It was alive, radiant, pulsing with green and gold. Roots twisted upward into arcs of living wood, leaves shimmered with impossible hues, and flames licked gently between them without consuming. It was not a crown made for a girl. It was a crown forged for something greater. She had returned, but she was not the same. The villagers stumbled back, their voices breaking into prayers and frantic whispers. Some called her name in trembling recognition, while others covered their eyes, afraid to look upon what they had summoned through their cruelty. The girl they had envied was gone. What stood before them was the protector chosen by the spirits, reborn through fire, soil, and vengeance. Her eyes opened and silence fell. They glowed with an eerie brilliance, twin flames burning brighter than any torch. When she looked upon them, each villager felt exposed, their lies, their betrayals, their jealousy laid bare as though their souls had been uprooted for her to see. No one dared to breathe. Her steps were slow, deliberate, each one sinking into the soil and leaving trails of glowing roots that spread outward like veins. The ground beneath her feet seemed to respond, steadying her, guiding her path, as if the earth itself bowed in reverence. When she spoke, her voice was not only hers but layered with countless echoes, the murmur of rivers, the groan of trees, the hiss of flames, the roar of wind. "You thought you could destroy me," she said, her tone neither a whisper nor a shout, but something that vibrated through the very bones of those who heard it. "But what you burned was not mine to lose. What you mocked was not mine to surrender. I am bound to the roots that sleep beneath your feet, to the soil that cradles your dead, to the fire that will one day consume you." The villagers fell to their knees. Some begged for forgiveness, pressing their faces into the dirt. Others tried to flee, but the roots that had avenged her betrayal shifted in the ground, rising to block their escape. They were trapped, as they had once trapped her, forced to face what they had unleashed. Her gaze softened for only a moment as she looked beyond them, past the huts and the fields, toward the wide horizon. She could feel the spirits watching her, their ancient presence curling around her like a cloak. She was no longer just flesh and bone. She was chosen, infused with power that reached far beyond vengeance. She understood now that she was not meant to be merely a victim or even a victor. She was meant to become a guardian. But still, her vengeance was not yet complete. The crown on her head pulsed, alive with memory. It remembered the fire that tried to consume it, the sneers of those who fed the flames, the betrayal that cut deeper than the heat ever could. As she raised her hand, roots burst from the soil and coiled around the villagers' ankles, wrists, and throats. Cries filled the air as they were dragged down, their strength no match for the fury of the earth. Some were bound tightly to the ground, their faces pressed into the dirt they had scorned. Others were lifted by twisting roots, their legs kicking helplessly as they were suspended before her, forced to meet her burning gaze. The punishment was not death, not yet. It was submission. The earth held them still so they would learn the weight of their cruelty, the futility of their envy. And as they struggled, she stood tall, her crown blazing brighter with each moment. She had risen from fire and soil, from betrayal and death, transformed into something both beautiful and terrible. No longer just the girl they envied. No longer just a victim of their scorn. She was the spirit's chosen protector, reborn through the roots of vengeance, crowned by the earth itself, and destined to be remembered not in whispers of pity, but in songs of awe and trembling reverence. And as the smoke cleared and the last of the flames died away, her voice rang through the village, carrying far beyond its borders. "This land has chosen me. This soil remembers. And so will you."